Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome. Welcome to the Accounting Foundation Pacioli Society Virtual Lecture, the only lecture we're having this year. Hopefully next year we'll have more. Welcome to all, especially to our Pacioli Society members, accounting practitioners and academics alike. Welcome to Manny Capsis, who is one of our council members who's here today. Welcome to other colleagues from the disciplines of the business school. My name is Maria Dybel, the academic director of the Accounting Foundation. Before we begin with the proceedings, I would like to acknowledge and pay respect to the traditional owners of the land in which we meet, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. It is upon their ancestral lands that the University of Sydney is built. As we share our knowledge and research practices, may we also pay respect to the knowledge embedded forever within the Aboriginal custodianship of country. May I also at this point just remind everyone to keep their microphones muted. Later during the Q&A, if you have a question, please use the participants function to raise your hand. I will then call you to ask a question. Alternatively, you may use the chat function to write your question. Thank you. Please welcome Simon Thorpe, President and Chair of the Council of the Accounting Foundation.
Thanks, Maria, and hi there, everyone. There's a number of people on the call, I know, but it's great to see you all with us. I too would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation on which the university sits. I'm sure we're all in different parts of Australia or elsewhere today. I also happen to be on Gadigal land, but all of you might be spread further afield. It's an honour to be a president of the Accounting Foundation. The Accounting Foundation at the business school, it's all about fostering collaboration between the business community and researchers. And the Pacioli Society, although it predates strictly the formation of the Accounting Foundation, forms a really important part of that collaboration and interaction. For 2020, for those of you who are pretty familiar with the Pacioli Society, it's been a different year, but it's been a different year for all of us for so many different aspects. And so today we have a webinar, which is the first that the Society's held. The topic today, of course, very, very important and really interesting, the socio-economic and environmental impacts of COVID. And to lead us through this discussion, we're very lucky to have with us two speakers, Dr. Arunima Malik, who's from the University of Sydney, and then Dr. Jorge Gómez-Paredes.
Okay, sounds like Simon is having connectivity problems, so let me just continue introducing Arunima. I actually asked Jorge, what is it about Arunima that makes her, you know, not just an academic, but one who's really interesting person? Well, because Jorge is based in South America, Arunima actually went once to Argentina and learned how to play the tango, dance the tango, and apparently she's quite good at it. So Arunima, okay, you'd have to show us your moves one day. All right, so okay, so that's Arunima for you. Now we've got Dr. Jorge Gómez-Paredes, Managing Director of the United Nations Sustainable Development Solutions Network for the Andean region. Okay, Dr. Gómez-Paredes is an environmental engineer with a Master of Science and PhD degrees in energy science from Kyoto University, Japan. And you've got, you know, the credentials in front of you, you've read that. But one thing also that I discovered of Jorge, guess what I did? I asked Arunima something about Jorge. And he's actually a classical guitarist. He learned at the National Conservatory of Music in Ecuador. So, which is, by the way, Jorge, our head of discipline, Professor Stuart Jones, is also a classical guitarist, right? So there's two things in common. So welcome to you both. And if I could ask now Arunima to actually start the lecture, really looking forward to hearing from you.
Thank you, Maria and Simon, for the introduction and also the opportunity to speak today. I'll just share my slides So thanks again, Maria and Simon to give me an opportunity to speak today about a study that we recently completed, and it was published in the journal PLOS ONE. And Jorge is a co-author on that study as well. So the study is about global socio-economic losses and environmental gains from the COVID-19 pandemic. In my brief presentation today, I'll give an overview of this study. I'll talk about the methodology that we used for quantifying the losses and the gains, and I'll showcase some of the findings as well. The core of this study relies on scanning upstream supply chains to quantify the impacts of COVID-19. We selected a range of indicators: employment, income, greenhouse gas emissions, and the question that we asked was, what are the direct and indirect spillover effects in terms of social and economic losses and the environmental impacts of the pandemic? This study was done at a global scale with information about a range of countries and a range of sectors. And as I'll show in my next couple of slides, we used a technique called input-output analysis to scan upstream supply chains. And the quantification went about by looking at the upstream supply chains of sectors, of industry sectors. So we had a model that captured interactions between different sectors in different countries, and using that model, we were able to see if there are reductions in the output of an industry in a country, then what would be the flow-on effects, or what would be the indirect spillover effects. So in this supply chain tree, I've illustrated an upstream supply chain. We have an industry down here at the bottom, and if that industry sources inputs from a range of other sectors or industries in the economy related to food, resources, goods, energy, and services, then each of these sectors, in turn, they interact with the rest of the economy. And here I have again food, resources, goods, energy, and services, and they in turn interact with other sectors in the economy for supplying inputs to this industry. So using a multi-regional input-output model, we aimed to quantify the direct and the indirect spillover effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. The assessment was done in a collaborative virtual laboratory platform. And if you're interested to know about this platform, there's a website for it. It's ielab.info. The platform was developed at the University of Sydney in collaboration with 8 other universities, and it allows for the construction of customized multi-regional input-output tables. So what do I mean by customized multi-regional input-output tables? I mean that depending on the application or the case study, we can construct input-output tables to feature specific sectors. So in this study, for example, we really needed information on tourism, because we know that tourism has been impacted by COVID-19. So we had an explicit sector in our table, or the model that we used for the assessment, tourism for these different countries. The ielab platform, it has been around for the last couple of years. There is one for Australia, China, Indonesia, Japan, Sweden, Taiwan, and the US. And these platforms, they enable construction of sub-regional input-output tables. So for Australia, if we want to undertake an assessment, a spillover assessment, or a supply chain assessment, then ielab Australia enables the construction of a sub-national multi-regional input-output table. So as the name suggests, multi-regional, more than one region, and within Australia, we can have a table or a model that captures interactions between the sectors in New South Wales with Queensland or Victoria or other states. For this study, however, we wanted to use a global platform because we wanted to capture interactions at a global scale. So we used ielab Global for this study on COVID-19. As I mentioned before, we used a technique called input-output analysis, which I'm sure many of you probably already know about. This technique relies on national input-output tables, and these tables document the flow of money between sectors in an economy. So I have a sample schematic on this slide where I have listed or mentioned some of the sectors in the rows and some sectors in the columns. and how they interact with one another in terms of goods and services flowing from one sector to the next. That is all captured in this input-output matrix. There are matrices for Australia that are produced by the ABS, Australian Bureau of Statistics, and also national input-output tables are produced by stats organizations across the world. The integration of these tables with physical accounts, information on emissions, employment, and income can enable quantification of impacts from a supply chain perspective. So we have a table that captures the snapshot between different sectors in an economy, whether it's a national economy or a global economy. And we have information on employment, income, and emissions. When these two data sets are integrated together, the model can be used for quantifying spillover effects. So in this study on COVID-19, we selected 26 sectors, and these are listed on this slide. The diagram on the left is a heat map showing the interactions between different sectors. It's color-coded, so we would have the regions and the sectors in the rows and the regions and the sectors in the columns and the interactions between those. So when you visualize this, it's kind of like a snapshot showing how the different sectors and the regions interact with one another. And we know now that COVID-19 has disrupted international supply chains. So this model can be used for quantifying that disruption in terms of the direct impacts and also indirect flow on spillover impacts. We call these spillover impacts because the spillover, so the direct impacts in one sector can spill over and impact other sectors in the economy or other regions in the economy, and they would be indirect impacts. So a similar example could be that for Cyclone Debbie. So in Queensland a couple of years ago, we had Cyclone Debbie. Directly, sectors in Queensland were impacted because of the cyclone, but a study done using this methodology showed that there were indirect spillover effects all across Australia because of disrupted supply chains. So in this study, 26 sectors were selected, and after selecting these 26 sectors and information on indicators, we selected jobs, income, greenhouse gas emissions, PM 2.5, SOX, and NOx. These indicators and the data at a global level were integrated with this trade model, and once this integration was completed, we then ran Leontief input-output calculations to quantify the impacts of COVID-19 at a global scale. This diagram shows the regions that we've captured in this study. And so there were about 40 regions that we captured, some of them countries, and some countries aggregated into regions. So China, Japan, Singapore, for example, we have some countries listed separately in this multi-regional table that we constructed, but we also have certain countries that we aggregated together into regions, for example, rest of East Asia or rest of South Asia and so on. So these regions and these sectors, these 26 sectors for each of these regions, and they made up the multi-regional input-output table that we constructed in IE Lab Global. In terms of data collection, of course, we needed information on losses, on damages. So in this study, we have more than 10 authors from different countries who speak different languages, and that was really helpful because the approach that we followed was to have co-authors who could speak different languages and translate information in different languages from a range of sources. So step one involved having co-authors and assigning specific countries to co-authors for which they were responsible for in terms of collecting data from published sources, whether it be newspaper articles or some of the journal articles that were coming in when we first did the assessment. After we had these co-authors collect the information, The collected data was then sent to two coordinators. They are also co-authors on the paper, who checked every single data entry to ensure that the information was correctly interpreted. So we worked together in a collaborative team where we had co-authors from different regions in the world who could speak different languages and help in collecting data from a range of sources. And the data that we collected was on losses, and losses according to the sectors in our input-output table. So if we have a tourism sector, for example, what are the direct losses in tourism for a specific region? And once that information was collected, we formed a so-called event matrix. We call it a matrix that holds information about losses, and it's an event matrix. COVID-19, we consider that as an event. So an event matrix was then coupled with the constructed multi-regional input-output table, along with information on employment, income, greenhouse gas emissions, pre-COVID. So before COVID, we have this snapshot of the global economy before we had COVID, and then this event matrix that captured information about damages for different sectors in the economy, and they were direct damages. So, and then we combined these data sets together to see what the spillover effects are. So if there's a direct loss or reduction in the output of a sector, how does that flow on to other sectors in the economy? The key findings, I have to mention that this study has already been published, and I know that COVID-19 is not over, and we're getting a second wave in many countries. So this study is based on information that we gathered and we processed, and then we completed the assessment. So it's based on information as of May 2020. So based on information that we were able to gather from up till May, we found that the consumption losses, they amount to roughly the GDP of Germany, 4.2%, jobs, 147 million, losses also for income, and the directly hit regions and the sectors, US, for example, air transport and related tourism industries. Of course, we've also seen a reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, which is larger than any drop that we've seen before. In terms of other emissions, we also looked at PM 2.5 and SO2 and NOx, and these for these indicators, we also see a decrease in emissions. Again, to stress the point, this study has already been published, and COVID is, we're still in COVID era, so the results, they need to be understood in the context of the fact that it only includes real information, gathered information up to May 2020. In terms of losses at a sector level, so of course we looked at a range of sectors in this study. We notice that effects are felt all across the world, especially in manufacturing sectors, in transport and tourism, and we also see spillover effects in service industries. So we have, if we pick one indicator, so we have consumption losses, income losses, employment, greenhouse gas emissions, PM 2.5, SO2 and NOx. So these were the indicators that we selected for this assessment. If we look at employment, most of the losses in employment, they occur in low-wage Asian economies, for example. And for losses in terms of, or reductions in terms of emissions, they will mostly occur in China, again, as of May 2020. I keep stressing this fact because these numbers all depend on the data that we were able to gather up to that point. And of course, the study has already been published now. We also, because the aim of the study was to look at spillover effects, we also wanted to unravel the upstream supply chain. So if you remember my second slide where I had a supply chain tree with the industry and the industry needing inputs from a range of industries in the economy, and they in turn interacting with the rest of the economy for providing inputs, we unraveled that supply chain in terms of upstream layers of production. So we have these upstream layers on the x-axis, and again, the indicators on the y-axis, and we can see here that spillover effects, that they are significant in the sense that direct impacts do get amplified as they ripple through global supply chains. So we do have indirect impacts resulting from direct reductions in output of sectors and those in sectors in certain regions. So we have this for sectors and also at a regional level. And just quickly, another example of disruptions in international supply chains because of COVID-19. Here we looked at all the sectors. We aggregated the results at a regional level to see what the disruptions are because of the international supply chain networks. And we found that out of the total income losses, about 21%, or income losses of about 21% are because of reductions in international trade. And where they are concentrated, that's shown in the graph. So of course, impacts are felt all across the world, as we can see from these lines. And this is because of reductions in sectors or reduced activity, reduced economic activity because of the COVID-19 pandemic. So far, I've given a quick snapshot or an overview of the methodology that we used and some of the results that we obtained. In my last slide, and before I pass on to Jorge, I would just like to summarize by saying that the COVID-19 crisis, of course, takes place in the shadow of much longer lasting and ongoing global crisis. And you might have seen this graph. I've taken it from another source. There is more than one curve to flatten. Of course, we need to flatten the curve for COVID-19, but there's more than one curve, as we can see in this diagram. And I'll now pass on to Jorge for the second part of the presentation. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let me try to project my slides. Okay. Well, thank you, Arunima. And thank you very much to all of you for the invitation. It's really a pleasure for me to be here with you. What I'm going to do in this second part of the presentation is to take some of the results, well, actually, the results that Arunima presented, and to try to put them in context of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. But for that, I'm not only going to look at that data that Arunima presented, but I also bring some other statistics and data so as to try to explore the question of how does the COVID-19 pandemic impacted the SDGs. And I will try to cover 17 SDGs in 15 minutes. So, well, I think I don't need to tell you what the SDGs are. I'm pretty sure you are familiar with those, so I'm just going to skip this one and say that what I'm going to do is go one by one, SDG per SDG, and quickly mention different impacts that the pandemic is having or has had on them. And I will be using this very simple qualitative scale that you can see in the screen of green, orange, red, gray to say mainly positive impact, mixed or moderately negative impact, highly negative, and still unclear. And I should mention that much of what I'm going to say and also this scale basically comes from the Sustainable Development Report 2020. So let's get to it. Okay, SDG 1, which is, as you know, end poverty in all its forms. Now, well, it seems that the pandemic is going to have a highly negative impact in terms of SDG 1. And that is because we know that there's been an increase in poverty due to job losses and the economic lockdown and so on. And just to clarify this, here's a graph from a report from the World Bank that just been published in October. And what it shows is the amount of people that live in extreme poverty. That is, as you all know, with less than $1.9 a day. And you can see what the trend was before pre-COVID and would be without COVID. And two scenarios, one that shows a contraction of GDP per capita of 5% and another one that shows a contraction of GDP per capita of 8% and how the number of poor increases. Now, the estimate is that in 2020, between 88 to 115 million people could fall back into extreme poverty. And in addition to that, some 23 to 35 million people could be added in 2021, bringing all to a total number of people living in extreme poverty between 111 to 150. This is new people that will fall into extreme poverty. And clearly this is going to set us back a couple of years in the progress that we were making towards these SDGs. So clearly highly negative impact. In terms of SDG 2, which is about ending hunger and achieving food security, it also seems there's going to be a highly negative impact. And that is because food insecurity is on the rise, despite the fact that global agricultural markets remain fairly stable. But nonetheless, well, here you have some estimates from the World Food Program, and what you can quickly see, well, here you have the number of undernourished people and also the percentage of population that is undernourished. And what you can see is that the pandemic came at a point where food insecurity levels were high, or were actually on the rise, and make things worse, of course. The estimate is that in 2019, there was some more than 600 million undernourished people, and in 2020, perhaps from 80 to 180 million to a little bit more than 100 million more will be added to that amount. And in business as usual, undernourishment is going to continue increasing towards 2030, perhaps reaching 841 million. So clearly we are not on track to meet this goal at all. Then you have SDG 3. And SDG 3 is about good health and well-being. And clearly the pandemic is going to, well, it has had a terrible negative impact because of the higher disease incidence and higher mortality from COVID-19. And I'm pretty sure you're familiar with this website. It's quite popular. It's from Johns Hopkins University, and shows the total number of cases, total number of deaths, and also the locations. So just to, you know, to put in graphical terms, the terrible impact that the pandemic has had. Okay, SDG 4, which is quality education. Well, here the impact may be moderately negative, we could argue, because as soon as schools closed, there was all of a sudden 1.6 billion children affected. But this prompted many countries, more than 90% of countries, to adopt some sort of remote teaching and learning scheme. And that could actually, we could be very positive going forward. But however, we know that a large amount of children, close to a third of all school children, cannot be reached still. And what I'm showing you there in the lower right corner is a picture of a kid that has climbed up a tree to try to get some signal in his mobile phone, or his father's mobile phone, in order to attend classes. And this is sadly not an uncommon sight here in South America, and especially in rural areas. So it's clear that not everybody is having access, and this may result in loss in the development of human capital. Now, SDG 5, well, it is clear that crises are never gender neutral, and COVID-19 is no exception. And in terms of gender equality, well, it seems they're going to have also a negative impact, because there's a disproportionate impact on women. For example, in terms of job losses. There's a study from the Harvard Business Review that estimates that the women's jobs are 1.8 times more vulnerable to this crisis than men's jobs. And also there's the fact that there has been an increase in domestic violence against women. And in the somewhat positive side, there has been a lower female mortality rate for COVID-19. Okay, SDG 6, which is about clean water and sanitation. Well, this, the pandemic has shown that this is a critically important SDG because limited access to clean water has meant impossibility by many million people to adhere to hygiene guidelines. So hopefully something good would come out of this, and we would realize that we really need to improve these cases. Here you have some statistics that show where we are now. More than 700 million people lack basic drinking water, and more than 100 million depend on surface water. Now on the bright side, perhaps, well, there's been some documented cases of water quality improvements during the lockdown, but just short term. And actually, there's more worrisome or more reasons to worry, because there's evidence that SARS-CoV viruses can remain in wastewater for several days. So this puts in danger people that use surface water. Anyway, SDG 7, okay, this is affordable and clean energy. Well, the impact may be mixed because on the one hand, there has been a reduction in energy prices, oil and electricity, which might increase access to energy. But then, and actually low prices may be an opportunity to redirect fossil fuel subsidies towards clean energy without the risk of major social disruptions. And since we urgently need to create jobs, we could start the energy transition that, you know, it's been said that will bring considerable amount of jobs. But then on the other hand, having low oil prices is always an incentive to use more oil, and that could be used in the economic recovery. Now, SDG 8 is all about decent work and economic growth, clearly having a highly negative impact. And here I can just repeat the results that Arunima showed from our study, where we see huge consumption losses, income losses, and mass unemployment. So clearly highly negative. SDG 9 is about building industry, innovation, and infrastructure. We could argue there's been some mixed impacts. On the one hand, a decline in industrial outputs, also on the other, more scientific and university industry collaboration, of course, especially in vaccine development, and a very an accelerated uptake of digital technologies, as we all know, which could actually bring many benefits in the near future. But then we have SDG 10, reducing inequalities, a huge negative impact because, as we all know, the vulnerable, being the elderly, refugees, migrants, and so on, they always affected disproportionately in economic crisis, and this is happening, of course, all over the world. The digital divide has also meant that many businesses have not been able to adapt to the new circumstances, while others have been able to. And in the meantime, the top 5 world billionaires have gained more than $100 billion. I mean, added $100 billion to their wealth. So clearly this is going to increase global inequality statistics. And then there is also, most likely there's going to be an increase in inequality between richer countries that can afford to bail out their firms and provide social safety nets, and those poor countries that cannot, right? And these inequalities may be exacerbated as countries compete to get vaccines sooner, in what the Director General of the World Health Organization has termed vaccine nationalism. So SDG 11 is about sustainable cities, and here we could say, well, impacts are mixed because many of the things that I just mentioned happen in urban settings. So you have a rise in urban poverty, and also inequalities in cities have become quite evident. Some people having more access, for example, to green spaces than others, and so on. But then on the positive side, and this again, I call attention to the results we got in the report, in the study with Arunima and others. There's been a significant reduction on emissions, increasing the air pollution, increasing the air quality of many cities. But we know that this is changing, and pollution is already increasing again. Anyway, here you have a famous photograph of New Delhi before and after the lockdown. All right, let me quickly move to SDG 12. Okay, we could say the impacts are still unclear because on the one hand, there has been a short-term reduction in natural resource use, but, and here you have the Earth Overshoot Day, which you know is an indicator of human consumption. And you see that it's projected to fall, to have sort of the level that it had in 2005. So that's good news. But then on the other hand, there is pressure to loosen up and postpone regulations on the implementation of a circular economy. Now, SDG 13, climate action, again, it is unclear. In our study, we found, as Arunima mentioned, that emissions dropped significantly, actually as much as they have dropped in many, many years. And this is precisely the kind of reduction that we would have to sustain if we would want to stay below 2 degrees of warming without CCS technology. But we don't seem to be going that path. We know that emissions are increasing again. So we may miss this as an opportunity to have an inflection point, let's say, in climate action. And there is pressure to actually reduce environmental safeguards in pro of rapid economic recovery. Now, SDG 14, it's about protecting marine life. And here again, on the one hand, you have short-term reduction in marine biodiversity threats, which is good. But we are realizing that all that PPE that we're using is gonna, well, much of that is gonna end up in the oceans. And also, there's a greater water demand, for example, for hand washing, which may result in greater water stress. And again, there's pressure to reduce marine safeguards. SDG 15, similar things, short-term reduction in biodiversity threats. But when you look at deforestation keeps on rising. Brazil is one case, it's not in the graph. In the graph, you see 6 Asian countries and projections for 2020 compared to other past years and done by WWF Germany. And it seems that it's going to be greater than in the previous years. And again, pressure to reduce terrestrial ecosystem safeguards in order to speed economic recovery. Almost lastly, SDG 16, which is about peace, justice, and strong institutions. Well, it's hard to say what the pandemic will do in terms of prospect for peace and stability around the world. But if you put together the fact that governments are having increased pressure to mitigate the effects of the pandemic with their increased public deficits and debts and increased unemployment and inequalities and so on, all these are factors that tend to increase social and political instability. And here you have a map of a forecast done by the University of Denver that shows what global fragility post-pandemic could look like. Australia is looking good, thankfully, for you. And then lastly, SDGs, little international, okay, this is all about international partnerships. And here I can say that there has been actually little international coordination, which should leave us a very important what is this lesson to be learned, because as Arunima pointed out, and here's the same picture again, this is one crisis that is going to be followed by many more challenging crises that will require huge global partnerships and collaborations. And we should here remember the words of the UN Secretary General that just said, you know, we are only as strong as the weakest in our interconnected world. Okay, with that I finish and I leave you with a summary of all the impacts in terms of the SDGs. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Arunima and Jorge. Now we're open to questions. If you could use the participants function to raise your hand and I will call you, or alternatively, please use the chat to write your question.
Thank you. Thank you, Arunima and Jorge. Very interesting, fantastic results. So Arunima, this little accountant here finds that sort of graphical output a little bit dense and confusing to understand. So I wonder, are you able to sort of maybe offer some examples of some questions that we can potentially apply this, this output to help us understand? So for example, let's imagine I'm the managing director of Coles and I know that I've had problems with my supply chain in 2020. So do these graphs give me some insights, for example, into what exactly has been the problems for me, for example?
Thank you, Matt, for the question. Of course, in multi-regional input-output tables, we work at a sector level and Coles and Woolies and other supermarkets, they do feature in some of the sectors that are listed in the input-output table. So initially what Coles could do, just going by your question, is to see what sector Coles forms part of and see how that sector has been impacted by the pandemic. We can isolate specific sectors in the input-output table and simply trace the spillover effects for those sectors, the direct and the indirect spillover effects. If Coles were interested in doing a specific assessment for how COVID-19 has resulted in reductions or disruptions in their supply chain, then we can input additional information into this existing multi-regional input-output table about Coles and their expenses, and then rerun the model using hybrid life cycle assessment to analyze the disaster impacts for them.
Okay, thank you. Mattia?
Yeah, thank you. It was very interesting. I have a question for Jorge, because he's representing both UN and the UN in this case. Some of the problematics that you listed towards the end pointed to growth in a sense, and how we want to speed up growth again. And I'm sure, I mean, looking at some of the studies that you've listed, there are some names that are implicated in discussing some of the journals in economics and ecological economics, for example, about degrowth. So I'm wondering whether the UN is discussing this topic at all, or is this something still far-fetched?
Okay, there. Well, I don't think I can speak in the name of the UN, but at least in the circles that I've been, not officially. And there's the two schools of thought, you know, the ones that think that we can achieve decoupling if we really invest more in technology and knowledge and so on. And the others that say, you know, even if we can achieve decoupling, the logical thing would be to curb consumption somehow, and at least not grow too fast where we don't need. I mean, definitely some countries need economic growth. I think we may agree on that, but some others perhaps, you know, could try to at least target economic growth what is needed and not grow so much, right? And give time for those who are working in decoupling. So I think that's a conversation that often pops up, and what are we going to do? Because we know that so far there has been some, relative decoupling, but not really the absolute decoupling, right? And if you don't have that, then the other option is obviously reduce economic output, economic consumption, but do it in a manner that won't bring all the things we're seeing right now. I mean, I think the pandemic, it's a perfect example of what non-planned economic degrowth would do. And this could come from a next crisis, or, I mean, by doing nothing, or we should now think how to degrow orderly, in a sense. You see what I'm saying? To try to reduce the impact. I mean, how to redesign the economy so that we can get by not having to grow at the maximum speed. I don't know if that answers your question.
Okay, so thank you very much. I'd just like to acknowledge Baljit Sidhu, who is a member of the Council of the Accounting Foundation. We've also got Martin McGrath here today, who served the Council of the Foundation until early this year. We hope to see you again in a future virtual lecture, but perhaps face-to-face, depending on how 2021 pans out. We need those dinners, we need those wines, we need those conversations on the table. So we hope to have that. Unfortunately, Jorge won't be able to join us. Ecuador is too far. But we wish you all well. Happy Christmas, and everybody take care. And thank you once again for attending this virtual lecture. Bye for now. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.